I'm going to hand you over to Susie. Dr. Susan Cunningham is based at the University of Cape Town and is going to talk to us this evening about birds in a changing climate. And Susie, I always tell people that I'm terrible at doing introductions. So I will let you introduce yourself. And I need to ask you to unmute as soon as I find you. Oh, you are unmuted. Okay, cool. I will go on mute and you can share your screen and take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. Well, I'm not so good at introducing myself either, but I'll give it a shot. As Derek says, I'm at the University of Cape Town, which is here in South Africa. I'm absolutely blown away by the diversity of nationalities and countries we have in the webinar room here. I'm really excited to be talking to you all over the world. So thank you very much for coming to this webinar. I'm blown away. I thought I would be talking to people from around here, maybe one or two from elsewhere, but this is a wonderful diversity and I'm very honored. So thanks for that. I have a funny accent, you might have noticed. It's actually not a South African accent, it's a New Zealand accent, which has gone a bit strange through my living for 10 years now in South Africa. So bear with me, and if you find my vowels a bit strange, at least you know why. Okay, so when Derek asked me to give this webinar, I thought about how to approach it really, because I've been working on birds and climate change for over a decade now, and there are a lot of stories that I could tell you. So what I've decided to do is try for a bit of an overview of the last 11 years of work that I've been doing with the Hot Birds Research Project, which is an international collaboration of really wonderful people in South Africa, but also in the USA and in Australia as well. So without further ado, let me get on with that. Okay, so the Hot Birds Research Project began in 2009. It was the brainchild of Professor Phil Hockey, who's the gentleman wearing binoculars in the bottom photograph there on the slide. And Phil hired me as a postdoc to start on this project in 2010. And when he passed away in 2013, I stepped up to take the reins essentially for the Cape Townian side of this collaboration. So we are based at the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology, which is at the University of Cape Town. The project is headed up by myself. I put a photo of myself on the slide just in case you can't see me in the Zoom chat. I don't normally put pictures of myself on slides because normally I'm pacing around the front of the room in front of a seminar audience. So forgive me for that. That's a little bit of an unusual thing. But that's me in the purple top, and my close colleague Andrew McKechnie there with the hat and sunglasses is the ecophysiologist in the team based at the University of Pretoria. And we have close collaborators internationally, but three of the main universities we work with are New Mexico, University of Western Australia, and the ANU. We work in the deserts of South Africa, Australia, and the USA. And we've been doing so for quite some time now. And the aim of the program of research that we've been carrying out is to understand the mechanisms that link changes in climate to changes in the range and abundance of birds. So what we're interested in is how birds respond behaviourally and physiologically to climate variables and what this means for where they can survive. So a lot of work that's been done on responses of birds and other animals to climate change is pattern-based, looking at the climates where they exist now and then projecting those climates to where they might be in the future, and then assuming that the birds will just follow. But what we want to do is understand the mechanisms, the behaviour, the physiology that links birds to climate, because then we can understand better whether or not they will be able to follow as the climate changes. So the arid zones are the place that we chose to work back in 2009, because arid zones are already extreme places to live, and many desert organisms exist at their thermal tolerance limits in the arid zone already. So we chose to begin our work in the deserts because desert organisms may therefore help us to understand what life can actually cope with at the hot end. In the last few years, we've been starting to expand our research into other biomes, but I'm just going to talk about the desert work tonight. And if you're interested in other biomes and other habitats, we can chat about that afterwards. And most importantly, desert areas are warming extremely rapidly, faster than many other types of habitats globally. In fact, back in 2009, when I first started thinking about this, at that stage, I didn't know much about climate change, and I hadn't really seen the hard data. And it's amazing how much of a difference the hard data makes to your ability to grasp what's happening to our world. So here are some of our study sites. This is the southwestern USA. And here's some temperature data from weather stations in Yuma, Arizona, from the 1980s at the left-hand side of the x-axis of this graph, up to 2010. The y-axis there are the number of days per year on which air temperature exceeded 40 degrees. And you can see that over the last several decades, there has been a steady increase in that metric. Lots of scatter from year to year, as you might expect, but a steady upwards increase. Here's another area where we work, the outback of Australia, and two locations in the outback, Curtin Springs in the Northern Territories and Birdsville in Queensland. These graphs give you data from the mid-1950s through to 2010 or so. The y-axis is that same metric, the number of days when air temperature exceeded 40 degrees. And you can see again the same pattern in Australia. And here in South Africa, a couple of weather stations close to some of our study sites, Uppington and Van Vliegsvlei. So these ones from the 1960s, again to 2010, and we see the same pattern globally around the world. And when Andrew McKechnie showed me these data in 2009, I suddenly realized, for the first time, I really felt the extent of the problem that we're dealing with climate change. Okay, so what are we doing in our research group? We're trying to understand ultimately how rising temperatures are likely to affect the population persistence of birds in hot deserts globally. But we're interested, as I said, in the mechanisms by which this manifests. So we're interested in the relationships between temperature and bird behavior, temperature and physiology, how these things relate to one another and how they affect the survival and reproduction of birds. Because it's via those links that we will understand how temperature is affecting population persistence. By understanding these links, we hope that we'll also be able to understand which species are likely to be most at risk as the climate progressively warms, and therefore that'll allow us to target our conservation action. So I'm going to talk to you about these bits this evening, the relationships between temperature and behavior, temperature and physiology, the links between these two, and how they affect survival and reproduction. All right, so thermal environments in arid zones are really extremely harsh. For example, in the Kalahari Desert, where I do a lot of my field work, air temperatures during summer in the daytime can exceed 40 degrees, but they can be less than 10 degrees, less than minus 10 degrees on a winter's night. And the most crucial part of surviving in a really extreme environment like this is the ability to maintain a safe and fairly stable body temperature in the face of these temperature extremes. So body temperature is really important for the processes of life. So a small animal in a harsh desert environment has to somehow keep its body temperature safe in the face of these enormous fluctuations. And maintaining a stable body temperature under these kinds of conditions is actually very difficult. So we know that's instinctively a case from our own experience, but it will be helpful for the rest of this talk if we do a quick sort of basic physics reminder about why it is the case that these air temperatures are so challenging for us to maintain body temperatures that are stable, and for birds as well to do so. We can think about this in terms of a cup of tea and an ice cream. This is my favorite analogy. So when you make yourself a cup of tea, like my cup of tea here, when it comes out of the boiling kettle, you pour it in and you steep your tea bag in there. By the time you're ready to drink it, it's usually around 70 degrees Celsius. That's a decent temperature. According to some standards I found on the internet from the USA, ice creams are supposed to be served at -12. This is the ideal temperature for an ice cream. So if we think about what happens to a cup of tea and an ice cream on a 23-degree day, it will hopefully give us a little bit of an understanding about the challenges of maintaining safe body temperatures in these conditions. Okay, so when you put your cup of tea down, like I have, and forget about it like I have, because I'm talking to you now and I've forgotten to drink my tea. On a 23-degree day, which is about the average temperature in my part of South Africa at this time of year, that cup of tea is going to slowly go cold. And we know this, we expect it to happen. If I had my ice cream out and I left it on the table beside me at 23 degrees, my ice cream is going to get warm. Okay. And that is because heat always transfers from a hotter object to the cooler surroundings, or from the hotter surroundings to the cooler object. Essentially, heat transfers downhill, if you like, down temperature gradients from the hot to the cold. So it makes sense that in this scenario, heat is flowing out of our cup of tea into the 23-degree air, and heat is flowing from the 23-degree air into our -12-degree ice cream. So far, so good, right? So let's think now about our hot Kalahari summer day scenario under an air temperature of about 40 degrees. So under these conditions, we're still going to lose heat from our cup of tea to the environment, and we're going to gain heat from our environment into our ice cream. But now we're dealing with very different temperature gradients. So the difference between a 70-degree cup of tea and the 40-degree air is much smaller than between the 70-degree cup of tea and 23-degree air. So that means that our cup of tea is going to cool down much more slowly at 40 degrees. And if I was sitting here at 40 degrees, this cup of tea would probably still be hot. However, our ice cream is, well, in a bit of a disastrous situation, really. It's going to turn into a puddle extremely rapidly at 40 degrees. Okay, so the take-home message here is that the rate of heat transfer from an object to the environment, or vice versa, depends on the size of the gradient in temperature between the objects and that environment. So spare a thought now for our little sociable weaver here, which is the cute little bird on a stick in the picture on the slide. This individual is trying to maintain a body temperature of 42 degrees in the face of these wild fluctuations in air temperature that it's exposed to in the Kalahari Desert. And of course, as a living, warm-blooded animal, there are some differences between our weaver and a cup of tea. For example, there are things our bird can do to maintain its body temperature that a cup of tea could never do. So it has some control over this process, just as we do, and we'll go further into that in a moment. But first, I wanted to show you some data on how well sociable weavers actually do manage to maintain their body temperatures in Kalahari deserts under climate extremes. So what I've done throughout this talk in strategic places is put photographs of the people who collected the data. And this is my fabulous student, Michelle Thompson, who did her PhD on these birds in the Kalahari over the last several years. And these data that I'm about to show you are a real body temperature trace of a sociable weaver collected by Michelle under natural Kalahari conditions. And in fact, this body temperature trace is the body temperature of the exact bird in the picture on the slide. That's blue on his left leg and green over metal on his right leg, so we call him Gab for green aluminium blue. This is his body temperature trace over 3 days in 2014. On the x-axis of the graph, you have body temperature. On the y-axis, you have the date. And what you can see here very clearly is that Gab's body temperature during the day is much higher than it is at night. And this is pretty normal for an endotherm. This is what we do too. At night when we go to sleep, we tend to drop our body temperature because it saves energy while we're sleeping to maintain a lower body temperature and a lower metabolic rate associated with that. During the day, you can see that Gab is maintaining a body temperature around 42 degrees. But there's quite a lot of variation in this, more variation than you would see if this was a human temperature trace. We are very precise in our thermoregulation, but birds tend to have a little bit more of a tolerance boundary that they will cope with. So we're seeing this up and down in Gab's body temperature as he's flying around and seeking shade. But you can see that he's always maintaining that body temperature very strictly between about 41 and 43. He's not letting it go much above that. So how is he doing this? How is this possible? Well, endotherms, like birds and like you and I, have got a really remarkable ability to regulate our body temperature physiologically by altering our metabolic rates to change the rates of body heat production and by controlling our rates of evaporative water loss. And this graph in front of you is what this looks like. So this is Thermal Physiology 101. Don't panic. Let me talk you through what we're looking at here. So our bird here on the slide is trying to maintain a body temperature somewhere around 40 to 42 degrees in the face of a really wide range of air and environmental temperatures, which I've put on the x-axis of this graph. The x-axis is your air temperature or your environmental temperature. On the y-axis, we've got the metabolic rate of the bird. So that's its, in this context, we can think of that as its ability to produce body heat. So you can see that when air temperatures or environmental temperatures are low, our bird is working hard to produce a lot of body heat. Its metabolism is high. And then as air or environmental temperature increases, the metabolism drops because the bird is no longer having to produce as much body heat to offset the heat that it's losing to the environment. So you remember that as the gradient between the bird's body temperature and the environmental temperature becomes smaller, the rate of heat loss slows. Therefore, the bird has to work less hard to generate enough body temperature to offset that loss. Okay. There's a flat area on this graph called the thermoneutral zone, between, in this case, about 15 and 40 degrees, 38, something like that. And this thermoneutral zone is the range of environmental temperatures across which the bird produces minimum body heat. It's kind of like a comfortable range for it. It's fairly easy to maintain a stable body temperature within that range. But then something very strange and interesting happens at the upper end of the thermoneutral zone. For some reason, air temperature is going up. The bird needs to be trying to not allow its body temperature to rise too high. It's trying to maintain a stable body temperature. And yet for some reason, its body starts producing heat again. It's very strange and very counterproductive. And it's happening because at the hot end there, the bird needs to start to evaporate water in order to try and stay cool. Okay, so this is what that evaporative water loss curve looks like. That dotted line there is the rate at which the bird is evaporating water to the environment. Remember that our bird is trying to maintain a body temperature around 40, 41 degrees. So when air temperature goes above that, it's not possible anymore to dissipate heat passively to the environment. The laws of physics will forbid it. When you have no gradient for heat transfer, you're not going to lose heat anymore. And in fact, when your air temperature or your environmental temperature is higher than body temperature, you're actually dealing with a situation where heat's flowing from the environment into the body. You've become the ice cream in this situation. The only way to combat that is by evaporating water. Okay, so this is what we do when we go for a run and we start sweating. We're trying to maximize our rates of heat loss by evaporating water from our skin. It works because in order to evaporate water, you have to use heat. So you're dissipating heat in the process of evaporating water. And the weird thing that's going on with that increase in metabolism, with the increase in evaporative water loss, is because to actively increase the rate of water loss, a bird like this, a bird like a sociable weaver, has to start panting. And panting means opening the beak. It means squeezing air through the thorax across the moist surfaces of the inside of the mouth. And that process of breathing heavily is what's producing that extra metabolic. So it's a little bit counterproductive, but it's a catch-22 that these birds are in. They're producing heat in order to dissipate heat by offloading water. Okay, so this is our schematic for Thermal Physiology 101. Here are some real data showing that birds actually do this. These are data on the left-hand side of the screen from a virtual sandgrouse with the metabolic rate on the y-axis and environmental temperature on the x-axis. So you can see that increase in metabolism, metabolic rate at the hot end when the bird starts working to evaporate water. The other picture is a verdin. It's a small bird from the USA. And this is a graph of evaporative water loss. And you can see that as environmental temperatures approach body temperature around 40 degrees, there's this sudden and rapid increase in the rate at which this little bird is evaporating water as it frantically offsets that heat that's flowing into its body from the environment. Okay, so maintaining a stable body temperature under these fluctuating and variable temperature conditions is really hard work. So when it's hot, why wouldn't you just let body temperature rise? Why not save the water and the energy and just let your body temperature go up? Well, the reason that animals don't do this is because body temperature is linked really closely to physiological performance. So body temperature is linked to how well your body can do stuff, how well it can function. And it's linked in a strongly non-linear way. So the picture you've got here is body temperature on your x-axis and performance. So your ability to do stuff, just about anything you can think of, ability to digest, to run, to chew, to hunt, to fly, it's all related to your body temperature. And as body temperature increases, so does performance, up to a range of body temperatures that over which performance is maximized. This is the range of tolerable body temperatures during which your body is working at its best. Okay, so for birds, that tends to be around 40 degrees. You can see that the slope of this line is asymmetrical. You've got a sort of slowish drop off as the body gets too cold and all your cellular processes slow down. But at the hot end, you have this really rapid reduction in performance when body temperature gets too high. And that's because at the hot end, drastic things start happening. Your proteins, your enzymes start to denature and unfold. Your cell membranes start to stick together. It's a disastrous situation that goes wrong very, very fast. So much so that it's been called the thermal cliff. So it's really important for animals in hot environments to regulate their body temperatures and to avoid falling off this thermal cliff. And if you fall off the thermal cliff, the consequences are dire. So this, for example, is a photograph of Carnaby's black cockatoos near Perth about, oh gosh, almost 10 years ago now. This was a heat wave event that knocked out a large proportion of the breeding population of these cockatoos over 24 hours. Here's a similar situation from approximately 2010. So this looks like a tree with all the leaves fallen on the ground, but those aren't leaves, those are the bodies of budgies. And this is a heat wave in the outback of Australia that wiped out thousands of birds over a very short period of time. Because they fell off the thermal cliff, the conditions got so severe that they were no longer able to offload body heat and maintain their body temperature in that safe range. So until very recently, these kinds of dramatic mass mortality events had happened in Australia, and they might have happened in the USA, but they'd never happened in Southern Africa until November last year, when this occurred here in Ongolo Nature Reserve in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. So these photographs were taken on the 8th of November 2020, the first time we recorded a heat-related mass mortality of birds and also of bats in this part of the world. Okay, so given that thermal tolerance and given that this range of body temperatures, being able to maintain those in the face of a huge range of air temperatures, incredibly important for survival. And given that air temperatures are rising so rapidly with global heating, one of the core questions which we've been asking over the last decade in the Hotbirds Research Project is which species can take the heat? What is the range of thermal tolerances of arid zone birds globally? And can we use anything about the birds to predict which ones are going to be able to cope with these kinds of heat wave events as the global climate continues to change? And to date, we've got temperature tolerance data for 56 species of birds from Australia, from the USA, and from South Africa. And we've been looking for patterns in those data that can help us predict vulnerability. This is work that's led by Andrew McKechnie at the top of the slide. And the first of these studies were done by Maxine Smith, who's the woman in the photograph below Andrew's, and whose work set the standard for this entire body of research. So here's Maxine and her husband, Ben, in a field laboratory in South Africa. You can see them there working on the computer. The computer is hooked up to a spectacular field respirometry system, which is allowing us to record thermal physiology of birds under variable temperature conditions and draw those thermal performance curves and also the rates of evaporative water loss and metabolic heat production that I showed you on the earlier slide. So what we do with this is we put a bird inside a little chamber in the middle of a cool box. So here's an owl from the Sonoran Desert, in fact, sitting in a chamber in the bottom corner of the picture there. That chamber is sealed inside a cool box. We control the air temperature in the cool box, and we're running air through these tubes going into that little box that the bird is in. And we know exactly what the water vapor, oxygen, and carbon dioxide content of the air going in is, and we know those values for the air coming out, and we can use those to calculate metabolic heat production and evaporative water loss by these birds. And so what we found over these 56 species are some really interesting things. We've found some avian superstars. I'm now in a position to tell you about the most chilled birds in the world. Let's start with our sociable weaver, which is where we began this talk. The sociable weaver is a passerine bird. It's a songbird. It's related to all of the other birds that sing birds. These are the ones that we sort of think of when we think, what is a bird? This is what comes to mind, a songbird, a passerine, the most diverse group of birds in the world. The passerines are constrained to use panting to offload water. That means that they have to squeeze the entire thorax and use all of their chest muscles when they need to offload heat, when they need to evaporate water by panting. And this picture here is an evaporative water loss curve for a sociable weaver with increasing air temperature on the x-axis. We also looked at doves and pigeons, the columbids. These birds are different because they're able to evaporate water through the skin. The passerines can't do this, but columbids can by changing their circulatory patterns, by changing the lipid composition of their skin. They can actually evaporate water through the skin. And here's an evaporative water loss curve for this namakwa dove here. We also looked at nightjars. So nightjars are really fantastic birds that are able to gula flutter. Many non-passerines can do this, but no passerine can. So gula flutter is the vibration at a resonant frequency of the floor of the throat, and it allows the bird to offload water really quickly, evaporate fast from the floor of the throat through the flapping of the membrane there. You might have seen cormorants do it, so it's very obvious in cormorants, but gula flutter is something nightjars do as well, and they're incredibly good at it because they've got this enormously wide gape. Okay, so here's a water loss trace for a rufous-cheeked nightjar. So remember how I told you that as you pant, you're generating body heat in order to evaporate water, and it's a little bit counterproductive. What we found is that one of the most important things that predicts how hot an air temperature a bird can tolerate is that relationship between how much heat it's producing for each unit of water it's evaporating. Okay, so what is its evaporative heat loss to metabolic heat production ratio? So for a sociable weaver, the maximum percentage of metabolic heat that it is able to offload by evaporation is 200%. So when the going gets hot, the sociable weaver can dissipate 200% of the metabolic heat it's producing by panting. And this means that it can tolerate air temperatures up to 52 degrees Celsius. Okay, so I thought this was pretty good when we started out thinking this is interesting, this is a desert bird, this is good. But then we looked at the doves, and we found that doves, especially desert birds, desert doves like the namakwa doves, do this extraordinary thing where they manage to keep their metabolic rate extremely low, even when they're working hard to evaporate water. And it's because they're doing it through the skin, so there's less of this panting, this huge effort going into the evaporation of water for a dove. And this means that they can dissipate 450% of the metabolic heat that they're producing. It allows them to tolerate air temperatures up to 60 degrees, which is remarkable. And when we first discovered this about 6 years ago, it was the world record. But then we looked at these gula fluttering nightjars, and once again, you see this almost flat metabolic rate. This gula flutter is so efficient, it's hardly producing any body heat at all, allowing these birds to dissipate 500% of the metabolic heat they're producing, tolerating air temperatures above 60 degrees, and this was a new world record. But the breaking news which might not be surprising for the South Africans in the audience, is that in fact Namakwa sandgrouse do this even better. 550% metabolic heat production they can offload using evaporative water loss. Okay, so what's the moral of the story here? Which are the most chilled birds in the world? Well, it's certainly not the songbirds. So the more species we add to this data set, the clearer it becomes that panting is really an inefficient way to evaporate water, and that passerines, plus songbirds, have a low evaporative cooling efficiency compared to non-passerines. And the thermal tolerance limits of passerines, the highest air temperatures they can cope with, are therefore lower than those of non-passerines. So if we look at heat tolerance data from the laboratory, we see that as evaporative cooling efficiency increases, so too does heat tolerance. And the passerines are all of the dots at the bottom left-hand corner of that picture. And interestingly, the passerines account for almost all of the birds in this photograph as well. There's only one bird in that whole picture that is not a passerine species. Is it therefore better to be a non-passerine than a passerine in a warming environment? Well, the answer might depend partly on the availability of water, because of course evaporative water loss is powered by your ability to take water on. But there's another important consideration as well. So all the data I've presented so far were collected in captive settings, but wild birds don't spend their lives sitting inside respiratory chambers. They operate in the real world. And in the real world, behavior mediates the relationship between climate and physiology. So if you consider this landscape here with an air temperature of 38 degrees, we take a photograph of that same landscape using a thermal imaging camera. We can see that the range of environmental temperatures at an air temperature of 30 degrees is actually really broad, from quite cool temperatures on the ground in the shade under those bushes to extremely hot temperatures on the ground in the sun. This means that an animal that's living freely in a landscape can actually use that landscape to manage the heat load that it's dealing with. So the heat load that you cope with in your environment comes from the environment that you're exposed to as well as your metabolic heat production. And so the environmental temperature that you experience when you're out there in a real landscape rather than in a metabolic chamber in the lab is a combination of a whole bunch of different things, not just the air temperature. It's also made up of reflected radiation from the objects around you, from the wind speed, from the solar radiation that you're exposed to, from humidity, such that a bird that's sitting up off the ground in the shade of a tree is going to be much cooler than a bird sitting on the ground in the sun, even if the air temperature is the same. And in fact, as part of the research we've done, we've looked at what environmental temperatures are available in thermal landscapes at different air temperatures in the deserts of Southern Africa. So we use these little black bulb thermometers to measure operative environmental temperatures in different parts of the landscape. And here are some example temperatures measured at midday during summer in the Kalahari when the air temperature was 37 degrees. Astonishingly, temperatures in a landscape can differ by more than 20 degrees for any given air temperature. In this case, we measured temperatures of 40 degrees inside the canopy of the trees and temperatures of 65 degrees on the ground in the sun. Recall that even our Namakwa doves couldn't tolerate environmental temperatures above 60 degrees. So even a Namakwa dove is going to struggle on the ground in the sun in this landscape, but it's going to be absolutely fine if it goes and sits up in the tree. The shade-seeking behavior can reduce the heat load that a bird experiences enormously. And in fact, there are several behaviors that birds could use in order to keep cool as air temperature changes. Obviously shade seeking, also reduction of activity because that reduces your metabolic heat production. And of course, panting or gula flutter to increase evaporative water loss. The important thing to know about these is that although they are used ubiquitously by birds and also by us, I mean, think of yourself in a hot landscape on a hot day, they potentially also carry costs. Panting obviously carries a cost related to the potential for dehydration, but all of these behaviors potentially carry costs in the form of missed opportunities to do something else. So if you, like on the Namakwa dove, leave the open sand where you were foraging for seeds and go up onto a branch of a tree in order to stay cool and keep your body temperature safe, you are missing the opportunity to forage. Okay. So it's as simple as that. There are trade-offs associated with these changes in behaviour. So another major branch of the work that we've been doing over the last decade in the Hot Birds Research Project is to try to understand these trade-offs. What are the costs and consequences of behavioural thermoregulation? What sort of cost do you take on when you use the landscape in order to keep cool? We've been working on a wide range of bird species. Here are just a few of them, and I'm going to talk to you about these ones here. Yeah, so the first case study I want to quickly present is the case of the southern fiscal, which is a bird close to my heart because I did my postdoc on the species. So these are data that I collected myself right back when I first arrived in South Africa. The southern fiscal is a true shrike. It's in the same genus as a loggerhead or a great grey shrike, which some of you might be familiar with. Like other shrike species, it's an ambush predator, and it prefers to hunt from high exposed perches like this one, with not too much clutter obscuring the view, but with no shelter from the sun either. So the graphs I have here on the slide show you something about perch preference in southern fiscals. On the x-axis, you've got sun L, sun H, shade L, shade H. That's for sun low perches, sun high perches, shade low perches, shade high perches. Okay, so a low perch, I classified that as anything below my eye level, so anything below 1.5 meters. And then a high perch is anything above that. The left-hand graph with the blue boxes is the preference of these different types of perches that the shrikes have on a normal day. Okay, so anything above 0 is preferred, anything below 0 is actually avoided. And we can see immediately that high sunny perches are where these birds want to be. But if you look at the orange boxes, these are data collected on days when air temperature was above 35 degrees. And we see this strong shift in preference from those high sunny perches to high perches in the shade. And in fact, that's a very useful thing to do if you're a shrike moving to a shaded perch, because it's saving you about 4 degrees environmental temperature. And remember how the physiological responses to heat are strongly non-linear. If you're saving 4 degrees, you might well be taking yourself from a position where you're evaporating tons of water and taking on metabolic heat load right back to a position where you're not. So it's potentially a highly significant difference in temperature. However, it has a consequence. And for the birds that I was studying, perches in the shade were much less successful places to be for a foraging shrike than perches in the sun. The prey captures that these birds made per minute from a shady perch were less than half those they were making from a sunny perch. The birds in my study were breeding, and this translated directly to the amount of food they were able to bring to their nestlings in the nest. On cool days, their provisions per hour are much higher than on hot days in orange. And this has knock-on effects for the ability of their chicks to grow. So this graph here has daily air temperature maximum on the x-axis and the body mass gain between dawn and dusk of a shrike chick on the y-axis. And you can see that when air temperatures are cool, shrike chicks at this age, they're 6 days old, are putting on about 50% body mass between dawn and dusk. But when air temperatures are hot, around 40 degrees, they're almost growing 0. They're almost growing not at all. So that's a huge cost related to the shift from sunny to shady perches for the parent shrike. And indeed, this does carry through to the quality of the chicks that these birds are able to produce. So these graphs here tell you something about the body mass of these chicks when they leave the nest, and also how long it takes them to do so. So if we look at this fledging date graph, what this is showing us on the data point that I'm pointing out for you there is that 1 day above 35 degrees, which is denoted on the x-axis, is causing shrike chicks to leave the nest on average half a day later. If we look over on the body mass graph, we can see that 1 day above 35 degrees there is causing the birds to leave the nest about 1 gram lighter. Okay. This is important because each additional day in the nest carries a 4% increase in predation risk for shrikes in this desert. And the smaller and lighter the fledge, the less likely they are to recruit as a breeding adult. So in this case, we have shade-seeking behavior by adult birds resulting in lost foraging opportunities, resulting in lower breeding success. want to tell you about a second case study as well. This is one of the best birds in the world as far as I'm concerned. This is a southern yellow-billed hornbill standing on its nest box at our study site, again in the Kalahari. And this is research that was done by my PhD student, Tanya van der Ven, on the top corner of the slide there. The southern yellow-billed hornbills are also living in this incredibly hot and dry environment. And as air temperature increases, they're spending increasing proportions of time panting. Okay, so they're doing that panting thing to offload heat from the mouth by evaporating water. This graph here shows you the rate of increase in panting as the air temperature rises. And like the shrikes, the hornbills are shifting from sunny, open foraging sites into the shade of trees as air temperature increases as well. So what Tanya was able to show is that panting behavior alone carries a cost for foraging. So when her hornbills were panting, their prey capture rate per hour foraging was drastically reduced, again, almost halved from when they were not panting. And this is because of the mechanical difficulty of trying to pick up food while you're also trying to hold your beak open in order to evaporate water. Furthermore, Tanya showed that foraging success was lower in trees than it is on the ground in the sun for these hornbills as well. And again, this results in a decline in foraging success as temperature rises. The hornbills in Tanya's study also were breeding birds, and their daily provisioning rate declines with temperature as a result of this network of interactions. And their body mass also declines as temperature rises. So one of the wonderful things we were able to do with the hornbills is place a scale at the entrance to their nest box. And the bird in the photograph is actually standing on a scale. You can see the load cell there on the box. So we were able to see what happens to the body temperature of the adult birds as air temperature rises. And as you can see here, it's dropping. And this is related to the compromised ability of these birds to forage. And in fact, their ability to maintain a stable body mass goes below zero on days above 36.5 degrees. So in a 36.5 degree day, your bird is actually losing weight throughout that day. So in this case, we've got thermoregulation, again leading to lost foraging, again leading to lost provisioning, and also to lost mass of adult birds. And indeed, this does reflect also in their ability to successfully breed. So the mean temperature during the nesting period on the x-axis here is strongly correlated with the probability of the birds actually fledging a chick at all. And the hotter it gets, if you do manage to fledge a chick, the smaller that chick is going to be. So in this case, if your mean daily air temperature during the nesting period exceeds 35 degrees, then the probability, if you are a southern yellow-billed hornbill, of fledging any chicks at all drops below 50%. And if you do fledge chicks at that very hot end, the chances are that they're going to be less than half the mass of a chick that would be fledged during a more normal, less heat wavy period. Okay, and in fact, these last three birds on this graph all died within days of fledging. The nice thing about the data that Tanya collected was that she worked so hard in the field and collected so much of it that we were able to use a fancy statistical technique called path analysis to actually tease apart how much of that impact of temperature on nest success came via that reduction in provisioning rate by the parents and how much via the nest temperature itself. And we were able to show that about 30% of that loss of nest success was due to the loss in provisioning rate of the adult birds, and about 70% of it due to direct temperature effects on the chicks themselves in the nest. And these kind of data are really useful for conservation, because if we know where exactly in the cycle the problem is, then we can take action to help. So in this case, we know that the most important thing to do in the first instance is going to be trying to find a way to insulate those nests so that the temperature inside the nest does not get so high. Okay, so compromised foraging is a consistent pattern across all of the species we've looked at. We consistently find critical temperatures in the mid-30s, after which things start to go wrong for birds, including loss of body mass, including compromised breeding success. The last bird that I want to tell you about today is the fork-tailed drongo, and I want to bring this bird in because I would like to give you some hope. These climate change talks are always a bit dire, but this species is something else. Okay, so we started working with fork-tailed drongos because we were wanting to be sure that these behavioural trade-offs we were seeing for thermoregulation, so the reduction in foraging efficiency, the reduction in provisioning rate, were indeed due to lost foraging success because of shade seeking and because of reductions in activity, and were not due to simply changing prey availability in the environment. It's entirely possible, of course, that as air temperatures go up, the availability of prey, the number of insects that are flying around goes down because they're also responding to temperature. So we did some experiments with these drongos. And we worked with a very famous drongo population that the BBC have recorded for their documentaries. These birds are extremely well habituated and they will come for mealworms that you throw into the air. Okay, so we supplied worms to fork-tailed drongos, both breeding and non-breeding, by finding the bird in the environment. Here's one of our field assistants, tossing a worm into the air, and then the bird will come, grab the worm and go back to its perch, look at you, wait for you to throw the next one. And what we were able to show by controlling the number of worms that we were throwing to the birds, always giving them the same amount regardless of temperature, is that the birds increasingly refused to fly out to catch a worm as air temperature increased. So the hotter it got, the more likely they were to just stand on the perch and look at you like you're a complete crazy person when you flung a worm into the air for them to fly for. The birds begin refusing to fly as temperature increases, suggesting that the thermoregulatory costs, so the cost of flight, the heat produced when you fly, is directly influencing the ability of the birds to forage. They also changed what they decided to do with the prey that they caught as temperature increased. So these birds were breeding, and as air temperature increased, they were more and more likely to eat for themselves the worm that we tossed to them, and less likely to fly with that worm to the nest. So again, birds are eating more of what they catch themselves with when they're hot, which suggests strongly that thermoregulatory costs, not the availability of prey, are directly influencing provisioning of chicks. Okay, so having collected these data, we assumed that we were going to see with the drongos exactly what we'd seen with the shrikes and the fiscals, the shrikes and the hornbills. We thought that we would see major impacts on the ability of these birds to breed successfully under hot temperatures. But then we looked at the fledging mass of chicks, and this is what we found. So somehow drongos are taking this hit when it's hot. They're not foraging as successfully, they're not provisioning as successfully, but somehow they're still managing to fledge chicks that are just as good when it's hot as they do when it's cooler, and we do not know how they do it. Okay, so what do we know so far? Well, so far we know that birds have built-in mechanisms to cope with heat. We know that they have more flexible body temperatures than we do, and we know that some species can avoid the thermal cliff through maintaining really low metabolic rates at high air temperatures, which allows them to have extremely efficient evaporative cooling mechanisms. This is especially true for doves, sandgrouse, and nightjars. We also know that birds use the landscape and alter their activity patterns to keep cool when the air temperature rises. But we know that these do not come for free. Hypothermia, that rise in body temperature that we saw the sociable weaver allowing a little bit, risks lowered performance at the tame end. The hotter your body temperature gets, the closer you are to the thermal cliff. And we know that even efficient evaporative coolers potentially face immense challenges in terms of water balance, especially in deserts. So if you are an amazing evaporative cooler, you still need to be able to get water to replace the water that you're using to stay cool. And we know that behavioural adjustments have the potential to reduce survival and breeding success in the longer term. The desert birds are living life in a fine balance, and climate change is tipping this balance up. So what can we do? Well, in our research, we are, excuse me, my computer's freezing a little bit, but in our research, we are trying to understand how some species manage to escape the thermal trap, if indeed they do. So we are working very closely with the fork-tailed drongos now to try and understand how they're mitigating those heat stress costs on the growth and nest success. Because if we can understand how they're doing it, that might help us aid other species to do the same. We are also using sophisticated statistical techniques to understand the mechanisms, precise mechanisms by which temperature is affecting breeding success. So these data here are for the southern yellow-billed hornbill. I showed them to you earlier, but we're now collecting similar data for southern ground hornbills, which are an endangered species. And we're working with Carrie Hickman and Rita Kovas to do this. Rita spoke to the group last week. And we're hoping that we'll be able to produce a graph like this for southern ground hornbills that will allow us to target hand-on conservation action for the species. We're also using the thermal threshold data that we've collected to map changes in exposure of birds to those thermal thresholds through space and time to allow us to plan for the future. For example, these maps here by Shannon Conradi show the rate of increase in summer average maximum temperatures over southern Africa for the current day on the left-hand side and for 2080 on the right. Everywhere in red on that graph is indicating average summer air temperatures over 35 degrees. And remember that the hornbills were not breeding successfully. They had less than 50% chance of successfully fledging a chick when air temperature went above 35 during the nesting period. But this graph gives us hope because it highlights two areas in southern Africa where even by 2080, we think that average summer maximum temperatures are going to remain below that critical threshold. So those are areas where this species might be able to persist. And graphs like this, maps like this, can allow us to target focused conservation protection for areas that are likely to be thermal refugia as the climate continues to warm. So we're continuing our work looking at the links between behavior and physiology and trying to measure these things in the same free-ranging individuals to allow us to bring together the lab work and the fieldwork sides of the program. We're trialing pragmatic and practical management interventions like insulating nest boxes for hornbills. And we're using really fancy new modeling techniques. Shannon Conradi, the student on the previous slide, is becoming an expert on these that will allow us to reach accurate answers for a wider range of species faster. We're still learning a lot about the thermal biology of birds as we continue with this work, but the situation is critical. The climate is warming and our focus is increasingly on applied conservation work. So my final slide is about what we can do ourselves in this crisis. And I think the single biggest thing that we can do individually is to embrace this concept that less is more, to reduce consumption and increase efficiency in everything we can do as much as we possibly can. That is what we can do as individuals in a climate crisis. But collectively, and because this problem is so much bigger than any one of us, we need to use our voices to press for change. Okay, the problem is systemic. It's not our own lifestyles that are the root cause of the climate crisis. It's bigger than that. It's our energy systems. It's our agricultural systems. So we need to use our voices to press for change. Okay, so that's me ending on a political note. And thank you very much indeed for listening to the talk. And I hope I kept you awake throughout.
Sorry, I was talking on mute. Thank you, Susie. That's a really, really interesting presentation. I guess we can probably stop sharing your screen and take some questions. So we have some questions posted in the chat. There is one from David who's asking, is there anything humans can do to help birds in heat stress beyond providing full bird bath of fresh water?
Providing water in the shade is one of the best things you can do, actually. So you can reduce the heat load that they're experiencing and give them access to a resource that they really need under those conditions. Short of that, in a heat wave, there's not much else that we can do. If you find a bird in collapse on the ground, you could try to bring it inside and cool it down for that individual, but in a bigger picture sense, water in the shade, best we can do.
So there's another question, I think also from David. The consensus is that migration is driven by food availability, but is temperature and escape from heat also a factor? Are there any birds that migrate from hot areas to cooler areas?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think most of the long distance migrations are birds going from summers to summers. So they are following resource availability. But if we think about nomads, which are a different sort of movement strategy that some birds have, especially in hot and arid environments, we tend to think that they're following the rain. So the classic view of nomadism is that birds follow rain because rain brings resources in arid environments, and then they're going to go there and get all the insects and seeds and things that appear in those circumstances. But we're increasingly wondering whether nomads, especially in Australia, might also use that movement strategy to escape from heat waves, especially it can be extreme in the outback. You get temperatures much higher than you get in southern Africa, and yet the birds that we've measured in that environment have lower heat tolerance limits. So that doesn't make sense unless in the context that they're moving to escape those big heat events in that scenario, in that environment. So maybe, we don't know yet. Great question.
Yeah, that's a complicated one because they're correlated, aren't they?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Let me see what else is here. This is from Alejandro. Thank you for a great presentation regarding the SEM modeling. Would you then conclude that the microclimate in the nest has a higher impact affecting the individual's physiology than the food intake itself, provided by the parents, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. Again, really great question. In this case, it looks like it. So in this particular model, the proportion of the variance that's explained by that pathway via provisioning rates is about 30%, whereas the proportion explained by the pathway via nest temperature is 70%. So in this case, yeah, it does look like it, but not 100%, right? So it's 70-30. So if we can do something about the nest environment, we'll make a bigger difference than if we do something about food availability. And we see this repeated in some of our other path models for other species, but not uniformly. There are certain life stages of nestlings for some of the species where the provisioning rate becomes more important than the direct temperature. So it really, it's not, this is, it's something that we need to do for each species, essentially. But it is a really useful tool for teasing those pathways apart.
Someone's asking if there will be a recording. Yes, there will be a recording. We will have it up on the Learn the Birds YouTube channel. I can't promise that it will be done tomorrow, but Friday to Monday, I'm going to the Drakensberg to look for the inter-altitudinal migrants that are coming down from the high land. And I will do it by Tuesday or Wednesday. So look for it either tomorrow or Wednesday next week. I have a question. I don't know. I'm taking you far away from the hot birds idea and the effects of global warming and stuff. But I often wonder whether temperature could be a factor in speciation. And I'm asking this in relation to something like the larks. I mean, we have an incredible number of lark species in South Africa, and they all occupy sort of slightly different niches. And it seems to me that there's a couple of them that are particularly well adapted to very hot conditions.
What an interesting question. I've never thought of temperature as being the driver of speciation. I guess in terms of the species complexes of larks that we have in Southern Africa, that they occupy finely different microhabitats. And so it seems, it's always, well, I mean, the assumption that I think we all have is that the speciation is driven by adaptation to those finely different microhabitats and different food resources in those areas, for example, after which perhaps you would find adaptation to different climate conditions that may correlate with those. But whether the temperature itself or the climate itself could be the driver of the speciation, I don't know. Maybe it can be.
I mean, I think I mean, all it would require is for a subset of a population with a particular genetic makeup to have higher survival rates in higher temperature environments, and they would adapt very quickly to those environments. I don't know. It's
Yes.
just it's something that I thought about when I think I mentioned before the Karoo longbill lark that I was watching for 4 days in the Karoo National Park, and they just have this incredible, you know, what for the rest of the larks to me is a strange behavior, where they're out on the flat areas with small pebbles in the morning,
Mm.
but
Mm.
as the day goes on, when it's hot, they hide behind the rocks, but they feed by feeding on one side of the rock in the morning and the other side of the rock in the afternoon. So they don't
Yeah.
actually lose anything because they're just following the shadow. And I thought that's, I wonder, are they adapted to that kind of environment, and therefore a population that actually got isolated from others and so speciated? Because there's some weird speciation happening in larks.
It certainly is, and it's a really, really fascinating hypothesis. Think carefully about whether we can test that. That's very cool.
I think it would be very hard to test, but it's fun sometimes to play these mental games. Yeah, I was saying that there's a lot of positive comments, a lot of people saying great presentation, really excellent research, really interesting stuff and all of that. So I said, I don't tend to read them all, but I think you get the gist. People are enjoying it.
Thanks very
And
much
thank you
for your positive comments.
And thank you for telling me I'm on mute. Sorry about that. So I think this is really great. It's been a really good evening and a really good presentation. And thanks everybody for attending. Hopefully we'll see you next week when we're looking at resource conflicts in marine electricity generation, which is very topical in South Africa at the moment as we think about building offshore windmills, wind generators. What do you call those things? They're not windmills, are they?
Turbines.
Turbines. Yes,
Yeah.
There we go. So thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Susie. And thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And thanks everyone for the lovely feedback and questions.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.